Welcome to In Focus. I'm Julie Gishuru, sitting in for Gwamaka Gifukwe. On this episode, we focus on private equity funds in Africa. Our panelists, Wendy Luhabe, who is the chairman of the Women Private Equity Fund, and she serves also as the chairman of the Advisory Board of Trustees at Glenhove Fund Managers. She's based in South Africa. Also with us, we have Dr. Frannie Léautier, who is the partner and chief executive officer of Mkoba Private Equity, a fund created to support small and medium-sized enterprises in Africa. It's headquartered in Dar es Salaam, Tanzania. Welcome, ladies. Wendy, let me start with you. In 2002, you funded the Women Private Equity Fund. It invests primarily, or has been investing, in women-owned businesses. What was the opportunity there that you saw, and what was your experience in that area?
The Women's Fund was a pioneering fund, and it was established to achieve a number of objectives. The first one was to respond to a funding gap in the market. Women were going to the banks to look for funding, and the banks were not interested. The banks, unfortunately, still regard women as a risk. The second objective was to grow women-owned enterprises from small enterprises to the medium sector, because it's only when you grow that you're able to increase your capacity to create more employment. And the third objective was to create additional employment opportunities. Raising the capital was a challenge. It took us almost 2 years to raise the capital. Private sector was not interested at all, so ultimately we were able to raise the money from institutional funds, like pension funds, which I think is the case with Frannie as well. So it was really convincing the financial services sector that this was a necessary intervention, and that there was a need in the market to focus, to create a gender-focused fund, and that women were already in business, and that for their businesses to grow, they needed to have access to capital. And of course, what's really fantastic with private equity is that it doesn't just provide equity, it also brings in the business experience to help to improve the financial performance of these companies, to grow them, and to strengthen management capacity.
Frannie, let me come to you. And this year, Mkoba Private Equity Fund launched, and this is a $300 million fund. What do you aim to achieve at Mkoba?
Well, Julie, it's a pleasure to be here. Mkoba was launched in April this year, so very recently. And what we aim to achieve is to invest in small and medium enterprises that are either African-owned or African-managed, that need capital between $1 million and $15 million, which is very difficult to get in the current market situation, and to help those companies not only grow in their industries or in their sectors, but to create jobs and generate technology leapfrogs in areas that are of importance to Africa, and of course, because we're a private equity fund, to make a good financial return so we can reinvest in the next batch of companies that we take up.
What's unique, would you say, about Mkoba?
Well, first of all, we are the first private equity fund of its size to be headquartered in Dar es Salaam, Tanzania, so that makes us quite unique. Secondly, the majority shareholding structure for the general partner is Tanzanian, 70%. Third, we have 2 women as partners, and the head of the organization is also a woman. There are, I think, only globally 7% of private equity funds are headed by women. So Wendy and I are in a rather unusual group, very small setting.
That's what you're doing. Yes, that's it.
And I think we are also unique in the approach we are taking, because we want to succeed not only in making a return, which is very important for private equity, but also in growing successful companies that are good for the countries in which we invest, meaning they're tackling either a sectoral issue like health or industry like payment systems in the banking sector, or they are helping a country create lots of jobs, because currently very few jobs are created by the companies that exist, so that the footprint that we leave behind is something that has an impact community-wide and not just for the companies in which we invest.
Well, ladies, let me ask you this. For people watching who have a sense of what private equity is but may have questions, how do you break it down in a very simplified form for people to understand what exactly is private equity? Wendy?
It's raising capital from either individuals or from institutional funds. So like pension funds, they're generally the kinds of institutions that would invest in private equity fund. And it's generally to invest, as Frannie was saying, in sectors of the market that are underfunded or that are not considered to be a priority investment in the funding space. They are also generally created to address areas of the market that are neglected. So either underfunded or neglected.
Frannie, some people would argue that the banks have ignored these areas because they are high risk. What would your response be?
I think there's a good portion of the argument that is true. Because small and medium enterprises, many of them don't have proper accounting procedures, so they can't document and show to the banks that they are profitable. Few of them have written down strategies for growth, so again, with the bank looking at future trajectories, they probably don't see any documentation on that. The owners would know that this is where I want to go, and they are always successful many times, but they can't document that all the time to the banks. So when the banks look at them, they see them as a big risk. And I think the third risk is that the current interest rates for growth capital are very, very steep for some of the small and medium enterprises. So private equity plays a good role in three ways. First, if you get private equity to your firm, the investors become shareholders, and then they sell their shares when they exit. And that's the beauty of private equity, because you have to exit. That means you are not holding those shares for a long period of time. You hold them 5, 6 years and then you exit. So that helps these entrepreneurs to get money where for 5 years they don't need to worry about repaying a loan to the bank, which can be quite expensive to service debts given the revenue stream they have. And many times these investments are capital investments that are needed for growth. And during that period of investing, your revenue stream hasn't kicked in yet. So with a delay in the way the revenue stream comes on board, private equity gives them breathing room that allows them to grow that revenue stream over time. And by the time you exit, of course, the business is valued much higher because it has taken maybe a new strategy, invested in building capacity, taken on new markets, and therefore it's more valuable than before the investment was made. And then the third area which private equity brings is the discipline of good business management. Because the companies we invest in are our companies, because we own shares in them. So we put a lot of effort working with management and the ownership to improve the performance of the company's productivity, strategy, business strategy, improving the accounts. And when we exit, therefore, these become very good investments for banks, because the companies then have precisely the things that banks would be looking for. But maybe the last area is that they become very good investments for other investors who are looking to invest bigger money than we are, because these companies then grow. So they could, some of them maybe issue a local IPO, and then after a few years cross-list in a bigger capital market. So the ones who could list, say, here in the Dar es Salaam Stock Exchange can in a few years cross-list with Johannesburg and slowly grow to become regional giants. And I think this is really the trajectory that we see for private equity.
What are the greatest challenges, though, that you face in private equity in Africa?
Well, the first one, which I'd already mentioned, is raising the capital itself. I'm sure Frannie will confirm. She's just raised a huge fund, and it was very challenging, especially in my case, because it was a gender-focused fund, and people didn't really believe that it was necessary. Definitely the traditional banks and funding institutions just did not understand why we needed to raise a gender-focused fund.
Do you think in 10 years that perspective, 12 years, do you think that perspective has shifted?
It probably has,
Okay.
because it was a pioneering fund. So when we raised the fund, this was unheard of. But, and I guess that's the price that you pay when you pioneer. You establish the foundation and you build the track record that helps future efforts like what Frannie is now doing, that there's now proof that a concept of this nature not only has a market, but it's actually necessary and it can work. And I guess that private equity is where micro-lending was when it started, where people didn't believe that lending to micro-enterprises was a viable business. And it's proven over the years that not only is it necessary, it's a profitable business and it fills a very critical social need. And so I think that that's how private equity is really developing, because developing enterprise development in Africa is such a critical intervention that is necessary for us to build the foundation that will grow, as Frannie was saying, the industrial giants that are going to, because private sector in any economy is such a critical pillar of providing stability, providing employment, and providing a stepping stone for the economies of the various African countries and economies to grow.
Right. Let's look at government policy for a moment. Is there anything that you would suggest needs to be looked at, amended? What are your thoughts?
I think that comes sometimes to the challenges that you mentioned, and I think Wendy has captured very well the fundraising challenge, because for first-time funds, it's very difficult to get funding. Because there's a checklist for most investors and they want to see track record. So if you're a first-time fund and you don't have collective track record, then they look at whether the people who are running the fund have that track record of investing. And for this sector that we're looking at, very few people actually have track record, because by definition these were not funded previously. So there's very little experience out there in investing in these types of companies. The challenges on the policy front have to do with property rights. In many of the countries we invest in, property rights have to be secured. And that brings it to the design of your team, to make sure you have people who actually know the local market, who live in those countries and therefore know what the constraints may be. The countries we're investing in, many of them were socialist countries, or still are, and therefore land is owned by the state, and therefore investing when you need large amounts of land requires permitting and leasing, and these leasing arrangements need to be secure. And there I think the government has a very important role to make sure that those land markets work properly. And we're very happy to see that a number of countries have gone through land reform of that nature, including Tanzania. I mean, in Kenya, you've had a very lively land market with secondary sales, tertiary sales, and so on. But it remains a challenge in a pocket of countries. The second big one has to do with the processes for registering companies and how easy and speedy those are. Because for some of these small and medium enterprises, merging with an informal company that has been doing very well in a segment of a market that is of importance to the growth strategy, bringing those vehicles into an existing company takes time in some environments. So I think here countries can learn from each other. For example, it took us exactly 1 day to register in Rwanda. So, I mean, registration processes in countries vary. So with companies like ours that need to operate in different environments, being able to invest not only in Tanzania, but also in the other 9 countries in which we invest, requires that ease of doing business so that investments can move ahead. The third one is more on the supporting infrastructure that would help those companies succeed. Take agribusiness companies. They all rely on transport and logistics, some of them cold chain logistics to take fruit, say from Lushoto to Dar es Salaam, or as many Kenyan trucks are now coming to buy fruit in Lushoto, where I come from. And by the time these fruit get to Nairobi or Mombasa, they are sort of deteriorated. So the cold chain logistics that are needed to support that value chain, or processing for canning and bottling juices and jams and fruit preserves. Those kind of investments rely heavily on transport infrastructure, but also to some degree on industrialization. So the investments that the government can make in prioritizing the types of infrastructure that would help these companies to grow, I think would be very important. And maybe the last one is more on the tax regime, because many companies remain informal because it's very onerous to pay taxes. So simplifying for the smaller companies the forms that they need to fill in order to be compliant in the tax area. And here I'm very happy to say in a country like Tanzania, for example, when you look at the mobile payment systems, once a company is registered and you have an agent who's an agent who deals in the mobile payment, they get registered and then they automatically pay taxes at the end of every month and so on. And this process of registration helps to formalize the informal sector. And it's very important to be able to do this in countries like the Democratic Republic of Congo, to improve and learn from each other, to take what works in South Africa and implement it in Mozambique, and what has been working very well in the Ivory Coast to bring it to Tanzania, or using what Ethiopia is doing and implementing that in Kenya or in Tanzania and so on. So I think we can bring those lessons, and that's the role that private equity plays. Because we invest in companies that eventually succeed, the policies that support that success can be shared across countries, and we can learn from each other.
Let's come to the fact that, I mean, over the past 10 years, the inflows in terms of private equity into the continent have certainly increased, but they're still a fraction of what we see on the global stage, presumably because of the challenges that we've been articulating here. But looking at the pattern of growth and development, could you project for us where we are headed and what transformational effect that could have on the continent?
Well, I think the growth, the fact that Africa is regarded as the next frontier globally is certainly a huge advantage for opportunities like private equity. But secondly, we need to begin to integrate private equity as part of the education system. It's not part of our education system currently, and therefore it's not understood by Africans themselves. The third opportunity that I see is that it could offer a way for us to do business with each other. One of the discussions that came up in this African Leadership Forum is the fact that we're still not trading with each other. And I think private equity could offer a very convenient vehicle for us to begin to invest in each other's economies and begin to share best practice and share the business experience that we have in different markets of the continent.
And back to the ecosystems that we create across the board. Your thoughts on this, Frannie?
I think Wendy raises an excellent point on how we can support intra-regional trade using investments in private equity. And one of the key bottlenecks is energy. So the countries that are energy rich can grow a cluster of companies that benefit from that richness in energy, and then create trade across countries that are poor in energy. Because energy is one of the biggest bottlenecks we face here, especially for manufacturing, which is a very energy-intensive sector. So I think the intra-regional trade, the specialization that is needed, so that competition is one thing, but specialization helps different kinds of companies to grow. And when you think of a value chain, if you take, for example, cashew nuts, cashew nuts can be used to produce up to 6 or 7 different products. But in Africa, we grow them, we export them, and that's it. Right. We could make animal feed. That's a whole new different business. We could extract the oil and use it for cosmetics, a whole new business. We could use the husks to make briquettes that can be used for biomass instead of charcoal, a completely different business. So when you think through these value chains and you think through the countries that can specialize in one or other of the segments, for instance, you have a very advanced cosmetic industry in Western Africa and Southern Africa, then there's no need really to build that kind of company in Eastern Africa. On the other hand, East Africa may be a great place to make animal feed because of the richness of the heritage of raising animals in this part of Africa. So those are some of the things that one could help happen And that would create tremendous inter-regional trade because you would need to be buying from one company or the other, and these companies would grow, they'd create jobs, and more importantly, they would provide exciting opportunities in sectors that young people are not going to right now, like agriculture. Say, okay, I'm growing cashew nuts, okay, that's one. If you tell your friends, I'm growing cashew nuts and I'm making the latest cosmetic, you know, that's
then it becomes exciting.
Exactly.
It transforms the game. So, you know, the challenges, and I guess, you know, my final question, let me pose this challenge. Do African governments realize, you know, the role that private equity can play? Are they supportive of this role? And finally, which other stakeholders would you say are critical? You've mentioned education and the curriculums. Which other stakeholders do you see as critical towards coming together and ensuring that this happens, and not in the long term, even in the short and medium term, it starts transforming the continent? Frannie, I'll start with you and then with you, Wendy.
Well, I would say we have received tremendous government support. When we did our launch here in Dar es Salaam, President Kikwete came for the launch, and we had the Prime Minister all day. We had all the key ministers, the governor of the central bank. We had a similar launch in Rwanda. We launched in Kigali, also at the ADB annual meetings. We had very good meetings with President Kagame, with key members of his cabinet. The Rwanda Development Board organized a follow-up meeting. We had the pension funds there. We had the insurance industry, the banks, the central bank as well. And we are launching now soon in Ethiopia, and we again are getting tremendous support from the Ethiopian government. We have former President Obasanjo on our advisory team, and he's helping us with diplomacy across Africa, and that's giving us tremendous support as well. So I think governments are very keen in supporting private equity. The other stakeholders we need are the banks, because when you arrange these private equity investments, there are segments of them that you may need loans for. And having a private equity partner gives the banks comfort. Right. So the banks are willing to come then with debt for some of the investments. And so we need the banks. The central banks are very important as well, because they are currency transactions, especially if you are investing outside in multiple countries, like say Kenya, Tanzania, South Africa, then you need to have some understanding of where the currencies are going to go, and then knowing what the central banks are projecting and so on helps a great deal. There is also the important need to work with the capital market authorities and the stock markets because of the exit phase, which is very, very critical. That's how private equity makes money in most of the world, is when they exit and when you are able to sell either in the stock market, issue an IPO, and so on. But the ones that I think are also really critical, particularly for innovation and uncovering new companies, are these investment centers, like the Tanzanian Investment Center. Right. Almost every country has these investment centers, because that's where people go when they're looking for funding. And the one area also I think is, for example, Wendy and I could work together, because some of the, I think 40% of the companies that are SMEs are owned by women. So there are opportunities also to work across funds, and those are critical stakeholders to build. So there are quite a number, but let me, these are just a few, because I'm sure, yeah.
That's an amazing array of stakeholders. Your thoughts, Wendy?
I think that the two that I would probably add are a way of targeting young people, because we know that the established industry is not going to be providing adequate employment opportunities to absorb all of them.
Right.
And the other stakeholder that I would mention would probably be, I'm having a senior moment, I can't remember who else was I going to mention, but I think just targeting young people and all the incubation centers. Okay. The incubation centers, and I think that a lot of countries are beginning to develop incubation centers and innovation hubs that are looking at new ideas and looking at ideas that are responding to the social challenges, which is an area that young people are very attracted to. They don't want just to create enterprises for the sake of enterprises. I'm seeing a lot of young people who are creating businesses that are really responding to the challenges of the continent, which is very exciting.
Right. Finally, literally in less than a minute, are you optimistic, looking forward at the potential Are you optimistic?
I'm extremely optimistic because, when I hear, I didn't know about what Frannie is doing. To raise a $300 million fund in Africa is unprecedented. To actually be raised from Africa, that for me is what is exciting, and that's really what is quite revolutionary. Because a lot of the private equity funds that are in the continent are generally raised from outside of the continent. Right. So this is a very encouraging sign, and I think it really bears testament to the fact that Africans themselves are beginning to recognize that if we don't invest in the economy of the continent, we will actually lose the benefits of the growth opportunities that the economy is offering.
I'm very optimistic, partly for the reason that Wendy mentioned, that Africans are now beginning to see the value of investing in their own companies and in their own countries. And we've started with the pension funds, which are the ones that really are growing tremendously. They have a lot of money, and they are becoming big players in this market. But I think for me, the optimism comes in knowing that private equity, in the way we are doing it, could be one of the ways to achieve a common shared future. We talked about that a lot yesterday at the Africa Leadership Forum. And we can have a common shared future in terms of the land that we all come from and live on and support in terms of the security of the earth and the protection of the natural resources like the land and the animals and so on, but also in investing in growing the kind of services and products that we all need. And for me, the optimism comes from knowing we can do that differently, that we don't have to make the mistakes that other countries have made. We can leapfrog ahead and do that in a different way, in an African way.
In an African way.
Professor Ali Mazrui puts it really beautifully. He says that Africans consume products that they don't produce, and they produce products that they export, that they export don't consume. So I think that what Frannie is describing is actually correcting that.
We can transform. We can transform the situation. Thank you so much, ladies, and thank you also for being at the forefront of transforming this continent. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Thank you.
Pleasure.
Thank
Julie.
you.
Thank you, Julie.